You also worked on a wild story about satanic ritual abuse.
Oh, yeah.
Which ties into all this crazy stuff.
I was in therapy back, this was like in early 90s. And I loved my therapists. They were such dear, intelligent people.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was an investigative reporter, they said, well, we've been seeing a number of patients, basically young women,
Yeah.
who in therapy are having these flashbacks, recovered memories
Mm-hmm.
of satanic abuse. And a lot of times they have multiple personality disorder. And then they said, and Satanists are responsible for more than 50 murders a year in Austin.
Satanists.
Yeah.
How do you define a Satanist? That would be my first question.
Well, my first question was, we don't have 50 murders in Austin a year.
Oh, wow.
Whether Satanist or not,
Right.
that's more than we've ever had. So, but I was intrigued, and then there was a conference of police who were the lecturer was about satanic ritual abuse, and this cop who was going around the country with his slideshow said that Satanists were responsible for 50,000 murders a year in the U.S. And once again, it was more than our actual total homicide count.
Right.
And these are cops. I thought, they should be a little more skeptical. But no. And so I went to my editor, Tina Brown, at the New Yorker, and I was proposed to do an article on multiple personality disorder. Mm-hmm. And she was, and I said, well, and sometimes in therapy they recover these memories of satanic abuse. Oh, that's so hot. That's so hot. She was so thrilled.
Yes, Larry, yes.
So I thought, well, how would I approach this? So the internet was young at that point, but it was very useful, and I could go through and find all these court cases of people who were suing their parents for abuse, or their therapists, or there were hundreds. And there was one case in which a person was convicted of satanic abuse, and he had confessed. And his name was Paul Ingram. He was a deputy sheriff in Olympia, Washington. And I thought, well, if there's anything to this, that'll be it. So I went to Olympia, and what I found was that Paul's had a family of 4, and 2 girls and 2 boys. And the girls, one of them, Erica, had made the initial outcry. And it got into the sheriff's department where Paul was a deputy. And so the assistant sheriff arrested him, and they brought in his preacher, an evangelical preacher, who told Paul that God will not let a false memory come into your brain. And then they brought in a psychiatrist who hypnotized him, and Paul had said, I know my girls wouldn't lie, but I don't remember it. So to help him remember, the psychiatrist and the preacher sat there with the deputy and elicited these memories of, satanic crimes. And in the church that they were a part of it, they called the Church of the Foursquare Gospel, there was a lot of gossip. You can imagine something like this was just, on everybody's mind. And and the preacher had access to the deputies and so on. So there was information coming out. And so that would generate new memories on the part of the daughters. And then it would be reported back to Paul what they were saying, and he would come up with memories, but that they never had the same memory. There were all these disparate memories, and the girls were talking about these satanic fires. They'd have these campfires, and they would the girls were impregnated and then later nailed to a table and had the fetus withdrawn from them, and that their neighbors had committed homicide, and it was bizarro stuff, but the cops took it seriously. They had helicopters flying around looking for, where the fires might have been. They were digging up the yard, and I asked the undersheriff, did you find any bones? There was, yes. Really, what was it? Well, it was an elk bone. I mean, obviously offering this as evidence, right? And but the thing was that Paul confessed, and he felt like he must have done this. And when the questioning was so bizarre, because Paul, he had two friends that were also implicated by the girls. So when Ray or Jim, would come in, what did they do? Well, I think they must have raped my wife. Okay, and then what did you do? Well, I would have gone back to work, and it was this. It was all in this conditional tense. It must have been this way. I would have done this.
Yeah.
He never said I did it, but he confessed. So he went to prison, and at some point, I was in L.A. And I decided to go to the headquarters of the Church of the Foursquare Gospel. It was a church that Amy Semple McPherson created back in the old days of Hollywood. And so I was talking to the leader of the church, and I said, that first outcry by this girl, Erica, happened, I think, at your summer camp. Oh, yeah. One of our counselors led that. And I said, is she here? Yeah. Paula, come on in the office, So Paula, the evangelist, who had been speaking at this church camp, came in, and I asked her about, the setting for this church camp and how many girls were there and what was her role and so on. And she said, I would be talking to them, and I would say, there's a girl in the room. I can see her in a closet. She's in a closet, and she's so afraid of her father, and she hears the footsteps coming towards the end. Some girl cried out, "It was me!" And a lot of hysteria, and so at the end of camp, she says, I was preparing to leave, and some of the counselors came over and said, "There's a young woman who needs your attention." And so Erica was actually a counselor in this at this camp, and we don't know what to do with her. She's on the stage and she's just weeping, and so Paula came over to Erica and she said, and I put my hand on her head and I prayed over her, and I heard God say, "You've been abused." And then I said, and it's been happening for a long time, and it's your father. Now, this was a very religious young woman, Erica was, and she was getting this message from God telling her that her father had been abusing her. There was no evidence. There never was any evidence of it. It was only this transmittal, the hand on the head. Wow. And the message from God, and it led to the ruination of Paul Ingram's life and the splintering of his family, and it was. But he served years in prison, And, once again, the business of trying to roll back a conviction is extremely difficult, especially one that had been framed as child abuse with a satanic addition to it.
Is that them?
Yeah, that's the family before it became the
What
victim.
What did he say about, like, what did anyone ever ask him, like, why did you?
Oh yeah, I
admit
talked to him
doing
about
this?
it. It's hard for him to understand because it seemed that he must have done something. He was very guilty, and he's a fervent believer. So he trusted his preacher and the psychiatrist, and
Wow.
I know you do a lot of interest and have a lot of interest in UFOs and stuff like that, but there was a study done in Georgia, which would not be allowed nowadays, but a psychiatrist or psychologist had a patient, and he told her, I'd like to do a little experiment. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to hypnotize you, and I'm going to put some suggestions in your mind. And it's not going to be true. It's just, just see. And, so he hypnotized her. And he said, you were late to our session. What happened? Which wasn't true, And she said, well, I was driving along the road, and I saw a cow on the side of the road, who was trying to give birth. And she was really struggling. So I thought I could help. So I got out of the car and I went over to help her. And he said, and then a light appeared. And she said, and then a light appeared overhead and a spaceship came down. And, and she was abducted. And he woke her up and he said, look, this is what you said. Bear in mind, you made it up. I planted it inadvertently in your mind, but just free yourself of this. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was as real to her as any other memory. And I think that's part of what was going on with Paul and to some extent with his children. They're fantasizing, they were charged with the idea that something happened. And that phrase has done a lot of damage, especially in child abuse cases and the old daycare pursuits. Remember the daycare hysteria? There was always, well, maybe they didn't, fly to Mexico and bury a giraffe, which was, for instance, in Austin, that was one of the daycare stories.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe that didn't happen, but something happened, or these kids wouldn't be so screwed up. So the jury would convict them on the something happened charge.
Yeah, what was that story about the daycare? The kid was telling their parents that they flew to Mexico and buried a giraffe or something? Where did that come
Fran
from?
and Dan's daycare. And, it was just a kind of neighborhood daycare. During that time, there were a lot of these daycare cases arising, and some of the parents were concerned. And so a mother asked, her daughter, had anything gone on in the daycare. And I think the daughter responded to one of the suggestions, well, maybe, or something like that. It was hard. So she called a psychologist, a local psychologist in Austin who I had interviewed, and she assembled some other family members. And they had, back then they would have dolls that they used to illustrate, where did he touch you here and stuff like that. So these were parents and a psychologist interviewing very, very young children. And I went to about an hour of a trial of Fran and Dan. I think they might have been tried separately. I don't remember. But there's a little girl on the stand sitting in her big sister's lap. And the prosecutor, honey, did Dan hurt you? And she said no. Did Dan touch you someplace you didn't know? Your Honor, may we have a recess? And then it was yes.
After the recess.
Yeah, and it made me really scared to think that, I was just a spectator. I wasn't on the jury. Right. And they might have heard other more compelling evidence, but they did hear evidence about how these kids were flown to Mexico and they were, slaughtering wild animals and then flying back just in time to be picked up by mommy and daddy. I mean, that they served years in prison before they were exonerated.
Wow.
And it's a really dark mark on our culture that kind of hysteria is allowed to proliferate.